We do have huge challenges in front of us: climate change, political polarization, the erosion of democratic principles, but we are also so much better off and so much better equipped to deal with those problems than any generation that came before us. And these young people, they want to be part of the solution. They give me the hope. Yeah, I learned about Common Ground and the international peacemaking organization, Search for Common Ground, while I was at a summit of people who were worried about polarization and toxic polarization in American politics. Common Ground saw some of the same markers of political violence that they work against in countries that have real civil strife starting to emerge here. That's a pretty compelling call to action. When I was 23 years old, I became Chief of Staff for State Senator Rodney Ellis from Houston. I had grown up in Houston. And Senator Ellis represented the most medically indigent community in the state of Texas. He also represented the Texas Medical Center, the biggest hospitals. My mom went to law school when I was in high school. We graduated on the same day. And she went on to have a very successful career as a healthcare attorney representing those hospitals in the Houston Medical Center, many of them. My mom represented Methodist Hospital when Methodist was sued by the Attorney General of the state of Texas for not performing enough charity care as a tax-exempt charitable hospital. And my mom's a very good lawyer and won that case. The judge determined that there was no amount of charity care required for a charitable hospital to receive a tax exemption. I was Senator Ellis's Chief of Staff. Senator Ellis represented both that hospital and the most medically indigent community in Texas. And he said, if the law of the state of Texas doesn't require any charity care to be considered a charitable hospital, we should change the law. Which the judge in that case had actually said, if the legislature intended there to be a required amount of charity, they would have specified it in the statute. So Rodney asked me as his Chief of Staff to develop a bill that specified an amount of charity care in the statute. And so we filed the bill. And my mom was hired by her client to advocate against the bill. And for the next 4 months, I led a weekly negotiating session with myself and the Attorney General's lawyers and the House sponsor of the bill on one side of the table, and the hospital executives and my mom on the other side of the table. And look, I was 23. At that time, I was an ideologue, and I had a pretty powerful sense of self-righteousness about things. But I couldn't hate the other side of this one because my mom was on the other side. So I learned from that experience to really see the humanity in people that I was arguing against in politics. I also saw that through that experience, my mom and I were able to help the two parties find their way to a negotiation. You know, that was really the experience that shaped the way I look at bipartisanship. It really has affected the way I've seen politics the remainder of my career. The beginnings of escalation from sort of normal political discourse, which has always been a debate, there's always been disagreement, there's always been winners and losers, to an environment where it feels like us against them, where people are seeing others as not having kindredness with them when they're separated by politics, even if they're not separated by anything else, even if their kids are on the same t-ball team. That seems to have emerged about 10 years ago. One thing that changed 10 years ago was the ubiquity of social media, the fragmentation of the media ecosystem, the fact that we are now mostly consuming information that's algorithmically generated for us and that generally confirms our priors, that those different media ecosystems that we live in separate us from each other. There's not a common set of truths that we all are operating from, so it's not surprising that we reach different conclusions. We've always had differences of opinion, but now we have differences of fact, and that's bound to create a lot of division. I think the other thing that changed, partly as a result of the phenomenon I just described, is that the political leadership became way more inflammatory. And obviously Donald Trump introduced a type of language to American political discourse that would have never been tolerated and not much less successful before. People take their cues from political leaders, rightly or wrongly. And so some of that type of language, some of that type of emotion has kind of gone from the top down. We work here at the Annette Strauss Institute on civics education. We have a middle school civics ed curriculum that I think is a really important first step. I think adults today need to re-educate themselves about media literacy because of the new role that the new information ecosystem in which we find ourselves. When the printing press came along, it transformed society in most ways incredibly helpfully. It made people literate. Before the printing press, there was not much reason to learn to read because there wasn't much to read. The printing press came along and there was an explosion of literacy and an explosion of content. The internet has had a similar effect on the proliferation of content, the ease of publishing your opinions to the world, the ease of finding different opinions as a consumer of information. And look, when the printing press did that 500 years ago, it destroyed a lot of orthodoxies at the time. We sometimes take for granted the amazingly good things we get from our access to information that's been enabled by the internet and our phones. I haven't been lost in 20 years. I tell my students, you don't know what it's like to be lost. Being lost sucks. We used to get lost all the time. And you had to decide when you were so lost that you were going to stop and ask somebody directions, or you had to unfold a map while you're driving your car. I mean, it was terrible. There's a million ways like that in which we take for granted the convenience and ease of access we have to information on demand. But it comes at a price. We also don't have the type of authoritative vetting of information that we used to have. And now lies go viral, falsehoods go viral, intentional, deliberate disinformation campaigns, sometimes from foreign sources, can corrupt our political dialogue in ways that weren't possible before. Let me tell you about today's college students. They have grown up in this media ecosystem that has elevated bad news to the top of their feed. They see nothing but failure. The news they consume tells them everything is getting worse, when in fact, by most objective measures, things have never been better. I spend the first 2 weeks of my class walking them through some of those objective metrics of the human condition. Fewer than 5% of children worldwide die before the age of 5. It used to be 50% not that long ago. So I try to teach them to put things in perspective. Look, I'm bullish about how this ends because the internet is still so new. It doesn't feel new anymore, but my students today were born the same year as the iPhone. And they're 18, 19, 20 years old. They're really smart, but they're not fully formed yet. And neither is social media, neither is the way the new information ecosystem. It has a lot of growth ahead of it, and I think we'll figure it out.